A nation can survive its fools, and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within.
They've been wrong about the wars. They've been wrong about jobs. They've been wrong about everything. The question is, are they stupid or do they have a plan? I actually think for the most part, they have a plan, but some are not too smart.
Welcome to the Horrible, Deplorable Show, the anti-globalist, America First program dedicated to dehoaxing the media and destroying the narrative. Here's your host, the founder and editor of the Daily Stir, Matt Wingard.
Welcome to the Horrible, Deplorable Show. My name is Matt Wingard, and with me, as always, is my good friend Doris. Hello, Doris.
Hello, birthday boy.
Oh, God. Welcome to the Gab community. Just a reminder that you can listen to this episode and all past episodes on your favorite podcast listening app, things like iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Pocket Cast, Podcast Addict. We also upload it to YouTube. It's on the405media.com, weekdays at 11 a.m., weekends at 5 p.m., powellmediainc.com, and we always put it on our website, thedailystir.com. I must make another correction. This was something that I've been doing. In every single episode, I've said, just search for the Horrible, Deplorable Show. And I tried that, and it doesn't work because it's actually under the Daily Stir. Our actual parent name is how it is listed in SoundCloud, and so that's how it goes out to all of the various pocket listing apps. So you want to search for the Daily Stir, and then you'll find the Horrible, Deplorable Show. So apologies for that. I want to stay on the school shooting, even though the press doesn't. They want to use it to push for gun control, but it's amazing to me how this story has actually turned into a huge indictment of liberalism and law enforcement who were inept at every single level in this. I see that the governor, Rick Scott, has announced that he's going to raise the age of some of these gun purchases to 21. My only question on that, as we debate the age of that, is, we've begun to have now, you see these scientific articles that say the brain doesn't fully mature till 25 to somehow explain why children are living with their parents until they're 26. But we have an age, a voting age, we have an age for driving, we have an age for drinking, we have an age for joining the military, we have an age now for buying guns. And sometimes those ages overlap, and a lot of times they don't. I think we're up to now in some states, up to 3 or 4 different ages when you're allowed to do something. And that seems crazy to me, and actually it should be legally indefensible, because you're making an argument that somebody is mature enough to handle something like a car or a gun or the right to vote or alcohol or what have you. How can you make the claim that they have the maturity to do one of those things at a certain age, but they need to be at a different age to do something else?
For example, you can be in the military when you're 18, but it seems to me that's one of the most important things.
And you carry a gun, and Rick Scott's already talked about how he's going to have exemptions for people who join the military. So apparently some people mature at a different age than others. Now, I realize most of us actually believe that, but for legal purposes, you can't have a hodgepodge of ages. You certainly can't say that some people are going to be designated as adults at 18 and others at 21 when it comes to something like, say, owning a gun. This is, I think, part of our general breakdown when it comes to issues of teenagehood and this worship of childhood that I've talked about in a previous podcast, and our unwillingness to force people to take on adult responsibilities. We don't, old ancient societies used to have rites of passage. Even the Jews have bar mitzvah, right? So almost every culture had this idea that somewhere between 12 and 16, a boy becomes a man, girl becomes a woman, and they would have ceremonies for this. This went on for thousands of years. And it wasn't necessarily that everybody believed at that exact age that every single one of their boys was as mature as the next one. But they, I think, understood very instinctively over obviously thousands of years of experience that some of this has to do with the expectations you place on people. So they would have the ceremony, they would make a big deal out of it, because they would be basically staring these boys right in the face saying, it's now time for you to take on male responsibilities. And you make a big ceremony out of it because you're trying to emphasize how important it is. We don't do any of that now. And matter of fact, all of our ceremonies have almost basically disappeared, and now with the various ages and the excuses that we make, we sort of have this phase from 15 to 25 where we suggest that whenever somebody's ready to, if they want to, maybe, then they'll mature and become an adult. And if they don't, they don't. And then we're surprised, or we pretend to be surprised, when we then have these succeeding generations who seem to be somewhat unmoored and a bit hysterical and incapable of facing sort of harsh adult responsibilities.
Well, we have one I can think of. How about for the Latinos, the girls, when they have the quinceanera?
Sure, of course, but they brought that from their culture in, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I think you can expect that over time, as people assimilate, that will happen less and less. Or they take on less meaning. I mean, most Jewish people are not particularly religious anymore. They still do the ceremony. It's like some Catholics just going to church on Christmas Eve. People are going through the motions, but they're not really imbuing that ceremony with the same kind of gravitas that it once had. It's more about presents and gifts and things like that. So the Wall Street Journal had just to talk again about law enforcement ineptitude. The ways in which the law enforcement community screwed up in Florida are just innumerable. I mean, they're just stacking up. The FBI had this story about the call that came in January that we've talked about. And this was a person close to the teenager who said that she was concerned he would get into a school and just shoot the place up. If only she'd been more specific. She said, I know he's going to explode, and that she was making the call because she wanted a clear conscience if he takes off and just starts shooting places up. You can see why no one would pass that along. And she talked about how he had the mental capacity of a 12 or 14-year-old, that he'd started out by talking about killing himself, and that had turned into wanting to kill other people. And she just said something is going to happen because he doesn't have the mental capacity. He can't. He's so outraged if someone talks to him about certain things. She talks about how he brought a bird into the house and then with his various hunting knives began cutting up the bird in front of his mother, who said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I want to see what's inside." And this caller tells the FBI, "To me, that would be a red flag," but apparently not to the FBI. Anyway, she goes on and on. She couldn't have made it more explicit. That was just one attempt to warn law enforcement. And then you have Ann Coulter's done an absolutely brilliant column this week that I recommend that you all go and check out. It was titled The School to Mass Murder Pipeline. And this was something that Sundance over at Treehouse had originally uncovered. And he did it because the Trayvon Martin shooting occurred in that same area, and it caused him to do some investigative journalism back at that time. And he had been issuing warnings for many years now about how Broward County was handling juveniles. And essentially, they had very high rates of black and brown juvenile crime rate, and they wanted to get those down. So rather than, of course, dealing with the problem, they came up with a really clever way of getting their juvenile crime rates down. They just wouldn't report the crime. So they had these school resource officers in the school whose job it was essentially to mitigate incidences when they occurred and to avoid at all costs an arrest or any kind of legal proceeding that would be documented that would create any kind of record. And this has been documented again. Treehouse started this and has done a great job of synthesizing it. But essentially, they didn't want to wreck somebody's ability to go to college or to affect some athlete's future, and so they would constantly find ways to downgrade the crimes they were dealing with or to not report them at all. And then, through the magic of this work, their juvenile crime rates dropped dramatically in Broward County. And the chief, who needs to resign and is just a worthless sack of crap, this Sheriff Israel, was going around bragging for years about how they had this wonderful program in which they had lowered the juvenile crime rate. Now, let this be very clear. They were not lowering the juvenile crime rate. Juveniles were continuing to commit crimes. They just weren't reporting them. They weren't holding anyone accountable. They weren't creating a record for any of these students because they didn't want to hurt their futures.
So basically, they were enabling the students to do bad things.
Right. So that's how you get a kid like Cruz, who can be visited by the police some 25 to 50 times, and it never results in any kind of a charge that would have led a background check to flag him so he couldn't buy guns, for instance. And then when you understand how this school system and the county operated, you understand the job of the school resource officers. And Sundance, again, has done a good job of explaining this, that the people who would get those jobs would be the ones who understood the politics of what needed to happen. In other words, the most honest cops would never be given those jobs because the school resource officer understands that his job is to downplay the crimes, to hide the crimes, to not report the crimes. So only the most willing officers to play that game would get those jobs. So it should come as no surprise then that the resource officer is cowering behind the staircase and thinking about his retirement rather than acting as a police officer, because he'd stopped being a police officer long before. It's an amazing amount of corruption, and it's an open invitation for the parents to sue. And of course, it just means the taxpayers of the county end up having to foot the bill for that. Doris was asking me last night if I thought this would actually change things. I think under a tremendous amount of pressure, the policy might change slightly, but this is going on all over the country. And some of it is driven by this desire to have equal outcomes when it comes to crime reporting by race, even though the actual crimes being committed by race are not equal. They still want to drive those figures to equality. And if you're politically driven to do that, you're going to do some pretty nefarious things to get that done. There was a tweet storm that came at Sundance from a retired NYPD officer that I want to read to you to give you a sense of how this pollution has infected law enforcement all across the country. And wherever you're listening, you might look into the policies of your local law enforcement, the county or the city, because probably there's a decent chance that some or all of these elements have made their way into your own local police force. And your life, therefore, is in danger because this is an abdication of duty that these folks are engaged in. So here's the tweet storm. He says, "I've never discussed this before, but here it goes. While working for the NYPD, I personally observed thousands of crimes that were downgraded or outright misscanned. In the Manhattan precincts, thousands of grand larcenies were turned into lost property complaints. How can this happen? You have to understand the NYPD is only really concerned with the reportable felonies sent to the FBI for the Uniform Crime Reports. This is the felony index of crimes. By hook or crook, they are recategorized, downgraded, or disappeared. We had a lieutenant whose major function was re-interviewing Manhattan tourists who were victims of grand larcenies, pickpockets, lush workers, etc. After confirming they were tourists and heading back home, the incidents became lost property non-crimes. Over and over again. Felony assaults are reportable to the FBI. No one cares about misdemeanor assaults. While on the desk in Manhattan, a mom called and said she had additional info about the perps who beat up her son. No detectives available. I pulled the report. Couldn't believe what I saw or heard. Her son had been brutally beaten by a mob of school kids. He suffered a broken jaw and separated shoulder and was thrown onto the subway train tracks. Amazingly, this was classified as a misdemeanor. To the FBI and NYPD brass, it's like the crime never happened. Lying with statistics." And then he finishes by saying, "I want to add the vast majority of NYPD officers and supervisors I observed conducted themselves in a professional and honorable way. A good percentage of those involved or responsible for crime stats did everything in their power to game the system." End quote. So you can see that we now have to reassess the fall off in crime that gets trumpeted and has been trumpeted over the last 20 years. I have no doubt that there actually has been some actual decrease in crime. But under pressure, it now appears as if a lot of law enforcement entities employed a whole bunch of tricks in order to drive their reportable crime statistics down. Just more fun with bureaucracy. Doris and I were out the other night with a couple of school teachers, and an interesting conversation ensued about gun control. Suffice it to say, the one-sentence version of that is that they could not imagine a world in which they would carry a gun into their classroom. And, of course, there was no surprise to this at all. It's what we talked about previously in the podcast. Most teachers are very liberal. They don't own a gun. They can't imagine owning a gun. And they would freak out if they thought somebody within 50 feet of them was actually carrying a gun. Now, there's nothing particularly mature or adult or rational about that. But that is the kind of attitude you would face in a school district if you were trying to allow a handful of competent people to carry their concealed weapons. I've seen on social media all sorts of 360-degree tactics. First of all, a whole bunch of liberals took to the Twitter to tell stories about some stupid moronic thing one of their teachers did one day, in order to make the point that teachers are so inept that they shouldn't ever be allowed to come anywhere near a gun. And of course, immediately people on the right began to suggest, this is one of the most important professions in the world, and our dear precious children's brains are being given to these teachers who you are now arguing are so incompetent that they would shoot themselves in the face if they had to hold a gun. And of course, then the left kind of backed off on that after a couple of days of teachers saying, can you please all stop telling incompetence stories about public school teachers? They sort of stopped that tactic. What I heard at that dinner with the teacher friends was that they thought that would be the end of public education if some people were carrying guns, and that it would completely change the dynamic in the classroom. And I had a whole host of opinions on this. One is, I think a lot of teachers, are, especially these liberal folks, are assuming that any policy would require them to carry a gun. Like suddenly they're all going to be brought out into the front lawn and be put into military training, and that they're all going to have to learn to shoot M16s. You know, the idea that there may already be staff members among them who are competent gun owners and who have a long history of using and training with guns and are perfectly capable of carrying and not shooting themselves in the face, that is unimaginable to them. And I've actually seen on social media where people have said that there are already teachers who carry their guns to school and no one knows it, which is the whole point of a concealed carry permit. People aren't supposed to know that you even have it on you. So as I've said before, it's going to take gun owners and parents going to the district and insisting that the safety of the children be put ahead of the irrational, hysterical reactions of far lefties who run our schools. But it is a good reminder to you of who it is that you're putting in charge of your children day in and day out, week after week, month after month. You give them over to them for 12 years, and you might think about that a little bit, about exactly what kinds of values they're imparting. These teachers have a strong desire to remain sheep. Now, if you allow your children to be taught by sheep, what kind of children will you get back?
You know, the irony here is that these same teachers feel safe having a policeman patrol their school, and yet we've just recently learned from the latest shooting that you can't really rely on the police either.
There's a strong argument that 5 or 6 teachers who are competent gun owners and who know these children very well, know their students, are much more motivated to attack and engage a shooter than a police officer who may or may not know those students very well. When it comes to acts of courage in any kind of a combat situation, veterans will tell you what motivated them to do something in which they could have very well gotten shot was this idea of the band of brothers, the love that they have for their comrades that they're serving with. And so it is those emotional ties that we have to other people that actually overcomes cowardice and motivates us to move forward in the face of danger. It's why a mother will do so many crazy things to protect her children. So we understand that instinctively. So why wouldn't we want, again, 5 or 6, half dozen of the most competent employees in the school who are already gun owners and already trained, you just don't know it, to carry a weapon so that they, when they're motivated, and we saw this in Florida. There was a teacher who stood in front of his students and died taking bullets to save them. He clearly had the courage to engage. He had no weapon with which to end the shooting. So the only thing that he could do was to sacrifice his life, and that's a shame. So all of this talk about what happened in Florida brings me to this point that I think it reinforces, which is, folks, that liberalism kills. It literally can kill you. The people in this school district and in this county, for the most part, are very left-leaning. This is the district represented by Debbie Wasserman Schultz. So while I'm sure there are some folks there that are conservative, and how you can live in that community and not know you're being ruled by liberals, you can't. And if you choose to live there, you're choosing to accept the consequences that come, the very real consequences that come when liberals are in control. And liberalism kills every day. A good example is, and that we've talked about just in the last few podcasts, right? The effort to empty the mental hospitals over the last half century, putting those people on the streets. Every day, someone is being maimed or killed by a mentally ill person who would in a previous time period have been locked up. And that's a consequence of liberalism. Think of the permissiveness around illegal immigration that has allowed so many violent criminals to be roaming around. Kate Steinle just being the most well-known example, although there are drunk driving accidents happening all the time where people are losing loved ones to an illegal alien driving drunk. 90% of the time when you read a story about a wrong-way driver, that's an illegal alien. This desire that we saw in Broward County to achieve some kind of racial balance in crime statistics, that is a liberal impulse. And instead of actually reducing crime, they cheat it in ways that puts everybody in the community, puts their life in danger. Think about how the physical standards in the military and in firefighting and in the police have been lowered in order to meet some of these quotas of getting females in there. I see clips all the time where people are taking bits from the show Cops, where the little woman, the little female officer, is getting absolutely clobbered by a criminal who's twice her size. And I've seen 2 or 3 minute videos where somebody's edited together a whole bunch of examples of these smaller sized women getting their butt kicked by a criminal that they're trying to arrest. And that's just ignored. The band just plays on as far as continuing to lower the standards like that. Now, that's not good for the women involved, who oftentimes are seriously injured and sometimes killed, but it's obviously not good for the public if the criminal gets away, and on and on. Now, think about how this liberalism has polluted science and medicine and the kinds of research that's done or isn't done, or where the money goes and what it funds versus what it doesn't fund. Things that are affecting fewer people rather than diseases that affect a large number of people. For political reasons, money is pushed around. Let alone that you've got all sorts of people doing all sorts of hoax science out there. Think of all the crappy food science that's been done in the last 30 or 40 years in which we've had to endure this constant merry-go-round of eggs are bad for you, eggs are good for you, salt's bad for you, salt's good for you, wine's bad for you, wine's good for you, chocolate's bad for you, chocolate's good for you, and on it goes, because it's all just these one-offs where they're using very, very corrupted scientific method standards to force an outcome so that somebody can get a PhD, and then it's not like they go back and take their PhD away from them 20 years later when somebody redoes the science and shows it was all just crap. But in 1,000 different ways, liberalism is out there putting you in danger.
How about climate? That's a good one.
Well, there's a tremendous amount of money wasted on, first of all, they do a lot of lying about what is going on and how severe it is, if it's even happening at all. And then, aside from that argument, which is just sort of endless and can go on with dueling reports all day long, the question really becomes, even if you assume that there's some warming going on, what's your method for dealing with it? What do you want to do? And all of that is just political. All the answers that are put forward are just about enriching some people. They're all scams. None of it actually does anything to address potential warming. Think about all of the things that this country achieved. I mean, liberals essentially began their march to power, well, much, much earlier, but they began to actually ascend the commanding heights starting in the 1960s, probably fully achieved by the 1990s. It's not hard to see a line of demarcation in this country between the 1960s and now. Think of the kinds of big things this country achieved prior to 1960, the culmination of which was landing men on the moon in the late 60s. Now, what big things has the country of the United States of America achieved since the 1960s?
Increased crime rates, that sort of thing.
You're
a
going,
lot of those.
Yeah, there's that. But I mean, where's the moon landing? Where's the big, we settled an entire continent, put men on the moon, won world wars, and I'm not supposed to see any connection between the fact that all of those kinds of big accomplishments stopped at exactly the same time that the liberals took full control of the commanding heights in this country. Now, there have been individual achievements, things like the internet and technological advancements, but that has been done mostly by individuals or small groups of individuals. These have not been national accomplishments of any kind. Matter of fact, the last thing that the last sort of echo that I can think of would be the interstate highway system. Started in the 50s, completed about roughly somewhere in the 90s. And even that was fully under attack by the late 70s and throughout the 80s. And the national highway system was never fully completed because the anti-road sentiment had taken hold and prevented it from being entirely built out. Mostly built out, but not entirely built out. But we just don't do big projects like that anymore. Doris and I also went to see a bit of community theater this week, and I proceeded to scold Doris for about an hour afterwards about the torturous experience that we had just endured. When it comes to community theater, it is mostly miss and very seldom hit. She and I went and saw the Book of Mormon downtown, about a month or so ago, and was put on by professionals, and it was very funny and enjoyable, and I recommend it to you. But community theater can be much, much dicier. And of course, this was a one act. It was an hour and 40 minutes, supposed to be a comedy. Nobody laughed for the first half of that show. Of course, Doris had wonderfully gotten us tickets, probably the best tickets in the theater. So it was like the fifth row right in the middle. But the one thing you realize 10 minutes into a comedy in which nobody's laughing is that you are not on the aisle and you cannot make an escape. You're trapped. I mean, I would have had to climb over 10 people to get out of this theater.
I slept through the first half.
Yes, she did. I looked over with envy at Doris, who was having quite a nice nap during the experience. And it's an expensive nap to pay for, but she was having a much better time than those of us who were conscious. There's this actor, Michael Ian Black. You might know him from a few things, none of which I can recall right now, but he has appeared in a lot of movies and TV shows. And he went on a Twitter storm after the shooting about how boys are broken, and it was a very anti-male screed, and I was kind of reading it bemused until about the 30th or 40th tweet from him, in which he concluded by saying that he'd only figured all of this out when he was 30 because he was raised by lesbians. And I thought, talk about burying the lead. I think that little bit of information about Mr. Black should have been the first tweet so that you could understand everything else that came from him. But that prompted the New York Times to ask him to turn that into an op-ed, and it ran as an editorial in the newspaper of record about how boys are broken. I think there was a kernel in there that I could probably agree with, which is that I think that women have adjusted to the modern world on the whole better than men, because the world is sort of constructed now in a much more peaceful, calm, sedentary way that would be, I think, more naturally pleasing to a female. And a lot of the attributes that men have honed over thousands of years of protecting and fighting and being ready to fight and being aggressive, because let's face it, up until about 150 years ago, most of life was consumed with the basics, having to find shelter, find food, those kinds of things, and to make sure that other people didn't take it from you. And strong, aggressive men were an absolutely key ingredient to survival. And it is men who have managed to create a world in which that's no longer necessary. The vast majority of inventions that have made the world calmer and more peaceful and easier inventions been made by men. So in some ways, we made ourselves a little bit obsolete. So I do think there is some of that. And I think it's also one of these things that's kind of a snake eating its own tail, because as we have made the world calmer and more peaceful and easier going, we've made the basic necessities of life easier to grasp. That kind of creates an impetus for things to get even easier, for even more. I mean, this is why there are now, there used to be basically 4 or 5 main appliances that made the kitchen a better place. Now you can turn on the TV and there's an infomercial for some kitchen device. There are literally thousands and thousands of kitchen devices now, because there's just this sort of feedback loop that occurs to make things even easier, even better all the time. And that leads to things like our school system being designed, I think, in a way that tends to favor girls. There used to be just as one example, there used to be 2 recesses. When I was in grade school, we had 2 recesses throughout the day. Most of them only do 1 now. Now, there's a lot of research that shows that the recess is actually much more beneficial for the boys than it is for the girls. Not that the girls don't need it, but there's a lot more sort of pent-up physical aggression in boys that they get out by going out for half an hour, 45 minutes, and running around and kind of, physically exhausting themselves. That allows them to come back and be much more attentive in class than they are when they're kept in for a longer period of time. And it is things like that. The fact that a lot of the boys don't have very many male role models in the schools. The school faculties are disproportionately female. That's a change over the last 100 years. And there's something to be said for boys having being surrounded by male role models that give them some sense of what an adult male looks and sounds like, so that they can go in that direction.
And as far as lesbians go, or any one-person family, one-person parent without a father living in the home, has been difficult in so many ways. And that's just another example of there not being a male present so men don't learn these manly skills.
Yeah, Mr. Black is trying to make the argument that it's basically toxic masculinity, and that's the part that I reject. I think it is a fallacy. It's just a wrong-headed idea that somehow we're going to create men that don't either exhibit most of the masculine traits that we know are inherent, or that you can somehow train that out of men. First of all, I don't think you would want to, because you're going to put your society in real jeopardy. It's sort of like disarming yourself when you're surrounded by other people who are fully armed. The rest of the world is not going to remove the masculinity from their men, and the idea that we would remove all the masculinity from our society is just absurd. But I also think it's just basically a biological impossibility, and that it's a much more healthy response to ask yourself, what do boys really need? What are the pulls of that masculinity, and how do we feed that in a positive way rather than a negative way, right? So, I mean, I think that part of the aggression that we see in boys and the gangs, it's obviously almost entirely due to the fatherlessness and all of that, but that's sort of my point, is that if you don't have a system to encourage masculinity and to provide those kinds of positive outlets for boys to exhibit their masculinity, and what we have is a policy of sort of denying it or shaming it, then what you're going to get is all the negative aspects of the masculinity, because the desire is still there, and boys and young men are just going to go find outlets for it because you haven't provided them a direction. They're going to go and find their own direction. And it's about carrying weapons around and acting like thugs and taking insane risks and doing all sorts of things that endanger the lives of other people. I mentioned the other week that the stats for boys and girls are wildly different, and I want to read you something from Christina Hoff Sommers. She said, girls and women are the privileged sex in education. From preschool to graduate school and across ethnic and class lines, women get better grades, they win most of the honors and prizes, and they are far more likely to go to college. Today, women earn a majority of the bachelor's degrees and advanced degrees. Latino girls are now slightly more likely to attend college than white boys. When an education policy analyst looked at current trends in higher education, he equipped only half in jest. The last male will graduate from college in 2068. Our schools have offered untold number of admirable and effective programs to strengthen girls in areas where they languish, in sports, math, and science. Where are the programs to help boys in areas where they falter? Reading, writing, grades, school engagement, and college matriculation. She's correct. She's correct on all of that.
Let's talk about Jeff Sessions. He's been in the news a lot this week.
Well, the president is hammering on him again, and he's whining about that and saying he's not going to quit and he'll have to be fired. And my sympathies are with the president on this. He doesn't really, he can't communicate directly with Jeff Sessions because that would be some kind of collusion if he was directing the Attorney General. So his only avenue is to publicly make statements that everybody can read so that nobody can claim he's doing anything underhanded. He's simply saying out loud for everyone to hear that he's dissatisfied that the Department of Justice and FBI are not being cleaned out. And at this point, and you're talking to somebody who was, and I'd like to believe I still am a huge fan of Jeff Sessions, but I think he may be suffering from a bit of Stockholm Syndrome, where he's a part of the entity now, and he's kind of bought into their culture, and he's surrounded by people he maybe personally likes, and he's become much, much too defensive about the bureaucracy that he's in control of. And this bureaucracy capture happens all the time to all sorts of people, but there is a tremendous house cleaning that needs to occur in those, and the level of incompetence from the FBI just continues to mount, and I don't see him expressing or showing the kind of urgency that I think the public, especially the right-of-center public, would like to see around the reform of these agencies. Now, we have an Inspector General's report coming out this month. Everybody's been kind of eagerly anticipating this, and I think, we have basically a two-phase expectation. The first question to ask when the IG Inspector General report comes out is, how tough is it? So, if it is really hard on the people involved, then it's the kind of thing that Jeff Sessions can pick up and use to move forward with indictments. If, however, it's a bit of a whitewash, if it's the kind of thing like what was released after the Clinton email scandal, where they weren't saying grossly negligent, they were just saying careless knowing full well that that change in the terminology meant that no charges would be filed. Those are the kinds of things we're going to be looking for in the IG report. Does it pull no punches? Does it hit hard? Does it call out the crimes that have been committed? Or does it play a lot of word games in order to keep people, scold them and highlight wrongdoing, but word it in such a way as to keep everybody out of legal jeopardy? So if we see that, then it's a total failure, and you can expect that Jeff Sessions will do nothing. If it's a hard-hitting report, and it's the kind of thing that could lead to indictments, then in the 1 or 2 weeks that follow that, we should be looking to Jeff Sessions to begin a sweep of people being fired in large numbers and certain people being arrested and bar complaints being filed against other folks. I have to say that that's delicious to think about, but I have very low expectations for this. I've believed for some time that nobody is going to be charged with a crime in any of this, including the Clintons. And somebody I like on social media did a little storm thread yesterday about how we just have to trust in Trump and the Make America Great movement, and even though no one may be charged, that he has a much larger plan. And I have to say that I'm not quite as optimistic about that. I love Trump, and I believe he can serve 8 years, and I think he can accomplish a lot of things. But I've made this argument before on the website that in a free society, there are the legal standards and then there are the cultural standards. And so we've seen this with sort of presidential power. I mean, the laws around presidential power haven't really changed dramatically, but presidential power has increased a lot in the last 100 years. And how has that happened? Because presidents just exercise power, and then if no one stops them, there's sort of this general agreement that that's the president's power. And through this process of sort of boldly moving forward, asking for forgiveness rather than permission, presidents have accumulated a great deal of responsibility and power. Congress has attempted intermittently to try to rein that in, but I'm even thinking of the War Powers Act. They pass a law that says the president can't go to war without their permission, and yet it still happens. The president still puts soldiers out in places and engages in military conflict, and the Congress doesn't rein them in. So it's an ineffectual law. All of which is to say that the president has accumulated power through this process of, I do it, and if you don't stop me, then we've sort of all agreed that this is my power. And I think that same thing is true of criminal activity or pushing the boundaries of what's ethical in politics. So if the president of the United States, and I don't want to name anyone specifically, but their initials are Barack Obama, if somebody were to, say, just use executive orders to keep illegals in the country, and no one did anything about that, then that would sort of be an accepted power of the United States president, right? So there was a lawsuit, and it got kind of partially rolled back, but now, at least the parent side did, but DACA itself is being held up by some federal judges. So you can see how the ball it moves, it creeps. And think of all the things that the Obama administration did, including using the IRS to target their opponents. No one was arrested for that. No one was ever charged with a crime for that. So, again, you had some people saying that was wrong, it shouldn't have happened. But if there are no real consequences, believe me, everybody on both sides of the aisle looks at that and says, okay, so we can use the IRS to target our opponents, and then if you get caught, there's a little bit of tisk-tisk, and there'll be some lectures in the op-eds of the major papers, but basically, that's okay to do now. You can expect it'll happen again. My argument is that if people are not punished for taking politics to new lows, or political activity, or political warfare to new lows, then those become the standards. And I know that a lot of the presidential powers, for instance, have been accomplished because Democrats have taken them. And then Republicans come into the White House and they don't exercise those powers because, of course, that was wrong. As if somehow that makes the powers go away. But what we see is as soon as the next Democrat comes in the White House, they reassert those powers again. So all we're doing is unilaterally disarming. We're not actually stopping the Democrats from using those powers. That would require actually punishing people when they go beyond the bounds of the Constitution and what they're allowed to do. All of which is to say that my argument would be that since Hillary Clinton did that email server thing and got away with it, that you can expect that kind of thing will happen again. That she and her husband ran a pay-for-play scheme through a foundation to make millions of dollars off of people that had interest in front of the State Department. They got away with it. So now everybody's, all of a sudden the New York Times and the Washington Post want to pretend that they're aghast that the Trump family has all sorts of business connections to people, and that may mean that favors are being given out in exchange for political decisions. Now, I don't think they're showing any evidence of that, but let's assume for the sake of argument that it's true. Since you didn't care enough to pursue or to push for criminal charges against the Clintons when they did that, why would you be surprised that the next administration from the other party would do it as well? You should fully assume that whoever comes next is going to do it as well until it becomes perfectly normal for business interests of the first family to be entirely tied up with the political decisions they're making because you didn't prosecute anybody. And you don't get to come after the Republican and say now you care when you didn't care when it was happening and being done by the Democrats. This is how the standards get lowered. And I don't think anybody is going to be charged for the fact that the Department of Justice and the FBI were used to try to undermine the campaign of the other party. And because of that, I think you can expect it to happen again. I wouldn't expect anything less of Republicans. If this is something that's going to be allowed to happen, you'd be a fool to unilaterally disarm. Of course, then, as Republicans, you're going to start at the highest levels, they're going to start thinking about how do they hire a foreign firm to go get dirt on their opponent using Russian operatives. They're also going to, if they have control of the Department of Justice and the FBI, figure out how they can get a FISA warrant to listen in on their opponent's campaign. Why wouldn't they? This is now the new normal because people did not get prosecuted. So I'm not as sanguine about this. I think the fact that people are going to get away with this, and I do believe they're going to get away with it, means that all of the institutional bars are lowered. And you can expect ever more nefarious activities to take place on both sides of the aisle.
And pretty soon we have no law at all.
I want to go back a couple weeks ago to this Anglo-Saxon controversy, now that we're on the subject of Sessions. He's at a National Sheriff's Association giving a speech, which, by the way, since then, they've dug up quotes from Obama saying the same thing. But because everybody is so absolutely hysterical and this anti-white, anti-Western civilization hatred is at like peak. Although I shouldn't say that because whatever it's at now, it can go higher, and it will. Anyway, he's there talking to them, and he says, I want to thank every sheriff in America. Since our founding, the independently elected sheriff has been the people's protector, who keeps law enforcement close to and accountable to people through the elected process. The office of sheriff is a critical part of the Anglo-American heritage of law enforcement. We must never erode this historic office. Now, to a sane person who does not have mental health issues, this is a perfectly reasonable thing to say, grounded in and historically accurate. Nothing he said wasn't true by its very nature. As I said, it's also, since this whole hysteria, it's been found that Obama said and has used the term Anglo-American or Anglo-Saxon heritage as well. So it's just ridiculous. But of course, what happens is the entire left just exploded about this, that this is some racist dog whistle to the whites. And it's just nuts. And you got this guy, Brian Schatz, who tweets, do you know anyone who says Anglo-American heritage in a sentence? What could possibly be the purpose of saying that other than to pit Americans against each other? For the chief law enforcement officer to use a dog whistle like that is appalling. Best no vote I ever cast. He's the senator from Hawaii. The United States senator from Hawaii. Just so that I'm clear, I'm not talking about the state legislature of Hawaii. One of the two federal representatives that Hawaii sent to the United States Senate, a guy by the name of Brian Schatz, is so unfamiliar with American history and so hostile to the basic principles of this country that he could tweet out something as stupid, as historically inaccurate, and as hysterical as that tweet, which proceeded then to get retweeted constantly, and it created this whole crap storm for 24 hours as people just went nuts on it. I don't know that I have any good advice when you're dealing with this kind of hysteria, but I will say this, as unhinged as the left is, it's uncomfortable, and it's certainly revealing, and it leads me constantly to the question of, now that you've seen who these people really are, how can we ever agree to allow them to have power in this country again? I realize we're going to have elections again, and in those elections, there's at least a chance that they will regain power at the federal level in this country. But seeing them for who they are now, why would we ever assent to be ruled by these people? I mean, they're insane, and they're unhinged, and it's not appropriate for them to be in positions of power over 330 million people. And I know that's very uncomfortable and disconcerting, but there are some positives to essentially all of this Trump derangement syndrome. One is what I've just said, which is that a lot of people who did a good job of sort of passing, if you will, of pretending to be rational folks have let all of their mental health issues spill out into the public, including U.S. senators, prominent reporters, other Democrat politicians, leading leftist activists at various environmental organizations and other kinds of organizations. So you can now see who they really are, because they did a good job of putting a front up in front of the CNN cameras or what have you, but now you know. And that information is very valuable, and it actually hurts them politically. I think there's a lot of people, the sheeple in the middle, who aren't particularly hardcore one way or the other, that may not particularly like everything that Trump does, but when they watch this hysterical left, they see people that they are not inclined to give any power to. So there is that upside to it. The other thing that this Trump derangement syndrome has done is that in the course of becoming unhinged and allowing their mental health issues to spill out, these folks are not as guarded and careful as they once were in how they talked about certain issues. We have, for the last 100 years, lost a lot of ground to the communists because they never admit that they're communists, and they always hide behind some other issue or pretend to be very rational about, oh, all we really want is this, when they have much, much larger goals. And that kind of tactic, while very effective, requires you to be very careful and very rational in your speech. And now that they're unhinged and unglued, they say all sorts of hysterical things, and what spills out of their mouth is the kinds of things they really believe. That's how now you're seeing all this anti-white hatred. That's how you're seeing all of this anti-Western civilization hysteria. And they can't even have a reasonable discussion about guns in the culture, right? They immediately talk about confiscating the guns, and you got people on social media, prominent people, saying we should go door to door to take them if we need to. Well, I actually say hooray for the fact that we can now all see them for who they are and what their real long-term goals are. Trump has so scared them, so frightened them that the march of history is no longer on their side, that they are no longer playing the short game, and they're letting loose with all of their real ambitions. And that's an education you couldn't pay enough money to receive. So I said last week that Sundance had predicted that the president would announce a NAFTA withdrawal after the South Korean Olympics. It hasn't happened yet, but he may still not be wrong. I saw that Leitzinger, who has been sort of put out on the Laura Ingraham show and others, so he's being much more public and talking about the need to balance these trade agreements. And then Peter Navarro was elevated to a senior position in the White House. Now, this is the guy who's written the book on Chinese currency manipulation, the guy that a lot of folks in the DC swamp didn't want to be given any kind of prominent trade position. So the president has made him now a senior advisor, which tells me that he's bringing the protectionists, the folks that are a little more hardcore on NAFTA and others and the need for reforms, he's bringing them into a sort of a close circle around him. And so Sundance could still be right that an announcement is coming. I saw this morning before we taped the show that they've announced some steel tariffs. So they are making moves. Also noticed the other day that the parliament in South Africa announced that they would be forcibly expropriating land from the whites.
Why is this happening now?
Well, there's a couple of parties vying for power in South Africa, all of them pretty left of center, but one of them openly Marxist, and its proposal came from the Marxist party, but it apparently passed pretty unanimously among it. You know, whites make up something like, 5% of the population in South Africa? I've seen predictions that over the next 10 years that'll probably disappear entirely, and I think that's true. We've seen this whole thing play out in Zimbabwe when they went through this whole process of expropriating land from the whites, and what happens is that the farming yields plummet because the people who are taking this don't have anywhere near the skill level that the people they're pushing out do when it comes to those areas and farming and just history with the land and knowing what they're doing. And the yields went way, way down in Zimbabwe, and then they're only just now trying to climb out of the disaster they created from that. And I think South Africa is is headed downhill. There's no doubt about it as a result of this. And I saw that I think it was the leader of the Marxist Party who said, "We're not advocating to do this violently yet."
Scary.
Because it's my birthday, Doris wanted me to to bring back the segment of Matt's humiliating stories. So I thought about which one to tell, and I think I'm going to tell the country doctor story. As I said, I have so many of these humiliating stories that we could never run out. It's just a matter of summoning the courage to broadcast them out on a podcast. So when I was, I'm not really in the mood to give my age today, but let's just say it starts with a 4. And many years ago when I was in my 30s and self-employed, or maybe once I got into the legislature, I think I had Providence and they gave me a list of doctors. And I saw that there was a country doctor just outside of town, out in the rural area, who was available as a doctor. So I thought, well, that'd be fine. I'd like a country doctor. So I chose him. And so I'm about 35 in this story when I go to visit him the first time. And we do the annual physical in which he says, we need to check your prostate. So we do the prostate check. And I don't, it's an interesting experience for those of you who have not. Everyone kind of, I think, knows exactly what happens. It's interesting. And I didn't really think anything of it. And I was very seldom sick. And I saw the doctor basically once for an annual physical. Same process every time. That went on for about 4 or 5 years. And then I got a letter from his office saying that he was retiring. He was an older guy, nice guy. And he was retiring and that, within 6 months we would all have to find other doctors. So I got a list from Providence, and there was a clinic that had been built in the town that I live in. And so I decided I was going to go there. And I went, I think I was 41 at this point. And I went to see my new doctor. It's a nice Indian lady. This is Dot, not Feather, Indian lady who was the doctor. They asked me ahead of time if I was okay with a female doctor, and I said I didn't care. So we had this nice chat. She did some basic things when it comes to the annual checkup, and then she said, okay, we're all done. And I was perplexed, and I said, not that I was excited to receive a prostate check, but I just thought it was unusual because I was getting older, not younger. And I said, well, aren't we going to do a prostate check? And she said, well, how old are you? And I said, I'm 40. And she said, oh, we wouldn't even start doing those until you're about 45. Okay, so that's immediately when you have to imagine the camera zooming in and out on my face as a look of horror slowly comes over me in realizing that this procedure had been happening unnecessarily for 5 years. So, of course, I, kept my dignity long enough to go home and then crawl into the next scene should be just shot of me cowering in the shower, crying with the crying game music playing in the background. Because I'm not exactly sure what my country doctor was doing with me. So there's my country doctor story. And happy birthday. Okay. So a couple of movies this week. Doris has been very busy with her fundraiser, so I've been on my own on that. One I just saw on the television that I want to talk about, and one that I went to the movie theaters to see. Angela's Ashes is based on a book about a Irishman. It's a biography of him growing up very, very poor in 1930s Ireland. And it was made into a movie in 1999. And I just turned this on. I was flipping through the channels and thought I'm going to watch it for a minute. And I got totally hooked because the movie is so exceptionally well done in just portraying the poverty of Ireland in the 30s. I mean, they were poor among the poor. I mean, they had it even worse off. They had a drunk father. So even among the sort of poor area where they were, it was even worse for them. Their home was right next to the outhouse that everybody else was dumping their chamber pots into, just as an example of how downscale they were. But I'm not really going to do this movie justice on a podcast, but the visual and emotional depiction of that poverty was so well done, so exquisitely realized and affecting. It is just a monumental achievement. I was really, really impressed because the poverty being depicted there is not specific to Ireland. If you watch that movie and you experience his childhood in that poverty, you will have an understanding of how most people lived throughout human history. That is what it was like to be poor in Rome in 50 BC. That's what it was like to be poor in Paris in 1650. Go anywhere in the world, and if you weren't essentially royalty or a baron or some kind of a artisan, maybe there was a very tiny middle class of people who had specialized skills, most people, if they weren't farmers, if they lived in the city, they were poor like that. That's what I think is so useful about that movie. It's, as far as a story, it's just fine. I mean, the movie's just fine. But as a historical depiction and as an insight in what it looked like, for anybody who cares about history or is interested in history, seeing that movie, I believe, will help orient your mind so that when you're reading about ancient periods, Greece or Rome, or whether you're reading about medieval periods in England or France or Germany or Italy, you'll have a much, much better idea of what an urban life looked like if you watched that movie. The other movie that I saw in the theaters was Game Night. This is a movie with Jason Bateman, who I just find very naturally funny. I mean, I like watching the guy. He did a movie a couple of years ago called Bad Words, where he, as an adult, joins a child spelling bee, and of course he's just crushing it and beating all the kids, much to the consternation of the parents and children. He found a loophole that allowed him to enter even though he was an adult. And that was a funny movie. And, when it comes to comedy, it's hard to make a recommendation because, I, for instance, find Jim Carrey funny. There's some people who detest Jim Carrey. So the comedian involved matters. If it's somebody that you find funny, then probably you're going to enjoy the movie. If it's somebody you don't particularly find funny, then you probably won't. For those of you who know who Jason Bateman is and do find him funny, this is a pretty good piece of work from him and the rest of the cast. It's essentially a comedy version of the Michael Douglas, Sean Penn movie, The Game, that came out in the 90s. Now, that was a serious movie, not a comedy, in which he's very wealthy but isolated, and his brother gives him this birthday present, which is this company that puts on kind of a wild adventure in your life that seems and feels real. And then, of course, in the course of the movie, he doesn't know what is actually real and what isn't, in which he thinks he's trying to save a woman in distress. This has a similar plot, but it's a comedy. So it's played for laughs. It's much, much more lighthearted in that way, and has lots of great twists and turns. And I was laughing very hard. I found a lot of it hysterical, but a lot of that is tied up in, again, whether you find Jason Bateman funny. I do recommend the movie. I'd give it a B+. That's about all the time we have for this show. Just a reminder that you can watch this episode and all previous episodes on things like iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Pocket Cast, Podcast Addict, YouTube, and the rest. It would really help us if you would leave a review on whatever app that you're using, especially if you can leave a review on iTunes. That would be the most helpful, because this podcast will get a lot more exposure on iTunes once we have 50 comments on the site. This is a labor of love, but we need to grow. Trump supporters, you are not alone. Goodbye, Doris.
Goodbye, Matt.